8 people have been executed in Utah. This is part 1 of the series. Gary Mark Gilmore, January 17, 1977. Following the discontinuation of the death penalty moratorium, Gary Gilmore became the first man to be put to death in Utah. Gilmore, the second of Frank and Bessie Gilmore's 4 boys, was born in Waco, Texas on December 4, 1940. A de facto statewide prohibition on the death penalty that had existed for over 10 years came to an end with his execution. When Gilmore was younger, his father beat him regularly. Frank's mother denied his paternity and asserted that he was the illegitimate child of magician Harry Houdini. His father believed this, even if no one else did. After years of traveling, the family settled in Portland, Oregon in 1948. Gilmore began acting recklessly at an early age, despite being bright and gifted in the arts. When he was 14, he stole a car and was sent to McLaren Reform School for Boys in Woodburn, Oregon. A year later, he was set free and resumed his illicit activities. A larceny accusation kept him incarcerated at the Oregon State Correctional Institution from 1960 to 1961. After being pulled over in Vancouver, Washington in 1962 for driving while intoxicated and without a license, he was sentenced to time spent in Rocky Butte Jail in Portland. Gilmore was given a 15-year prison term in 1964 for assault and armed robbery. He committed an armed robbery in Portland after being released from Oregon State Penitentiary in 1972 to go back to school. Gilmore was a prisoner in Oregon who constantly caused problems for his guards. He was given the antipsychotic medication Prolixin to treat his condition, and in January 1975, they managed to arrange for his transfer to the federal penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, which at the time was a maximum security prison. Gilmore was granted parole by Marion on April 9, 1976, and was given to his Provo, Utah cousin Brenda Nicol. Nicole D'Amico offered Gilmore a position in her father's shoe repair company. Along with working for an insulation company, Gilmore also began dating Nicole Baker Barrett, who was 19 at the time. But Gilmore continued to drink excessively and engage in minor crimes. Barrett ended their relationship after they had dated for a while because she was afraid of his violent outbursts. Gilmore went on his deadly rampage not long after. On Monday, July 19, 1976, Max Jensen showed up for work as usual at the self-service gas station in Orem, Utah. Gilmore got into a fight with his girlfriend that night and took April, her younger, unstable sister, on a drive. At 10:30 p.m., he told April he had to make a phone call. He left her in the truck and turned away. Gilmore turned the corner and was out of her sight, entering the Sinclair gas station. He saw the attendant right away and understood there was nobody else in the area. He went over to Max Jensen and pointed the .22 Browning automatic at him. He instructed Jensen to empty his pockets completely, which the young Mormon did right away. Subsequently, he directed Jensen to go into the bathroom and lie on the ground with his arms folded beneath him. He was doing everything Gilmore told him. Gilmore raised the weapon to Jensen's head. "This one's for me," he whispered before firing. The rifle was then pressed right up against Jensen's head, and he pulled the trigger again, this time for Nicole. Gilmore spent the previous night in a motel with April, and then the next night he spent it at City Center Motel in Provo. The property was inhabited by the attendant Ben Bushnell, his wife, and their baby. Gilmore gave Ben an order to hand up the cash box and take a seat on the ground. Then he shot Bushnell with his gun. Then Bushnell's wife came in, and Gilmore grabbed the cash box and left. When Gilmore was attempting to dispose of the firearm in a nearby bush, he unintentionally shot himself in the hand. By Wednesday, Gilmore's cousin Brenda Nicol had turned him up to the authorities. Near a barricade, Gilmore gave up without a fight. He subsequently admitted to both murders, despite his initial denial. He was only charged with Bushnell's murder in that instance because of the exceptionally strong evidence. The trial began and lasted for only 3 days, barely 11 weeks after the murder. Despite Gilmore's best efforts to convince the jury that he committed the acts while mad, he was found guilty on October 7 and sentenced to death. He had not been a candidate for the death penalty until July 2nd, when the U.S. Supreme Court reinstated the capital penalty nationwide. During the last 3 months of his life, Gilmore became well known thanks to the media and opponents of the death sentence. Gilmore baffled his supposed rescuers by publicly expressing his willingness to die, which caused them to doubt the legality of Utah's death penalty legislation. At this time, he attempted 2 pill suicides and went on a hunger strike. The execution date, which was originally set for November 15, 1976, was rescheduled twice. On December 13, the U.S. Supreme Court denied Gilmore's mother's plea for a stay of execution, ruling that the death penalty may proceed. The night before his execution, Gilmore had been given a lot of drugs. When his family visited, he was joyful. He accepted his uncle's offer of whiskey and took a sip. Then one of his favorite musicians, Johnny Cash, called and sang a song for him. Gilmore tried singing along with him. Subsequently, he taped a message for Nicole, pleading with her to think of joining him in the afterlife as a favor. For 5 hours and 20 minutes, Gilmore thought his death had been postponed a third time. Through a live webcast of a news conference held at 2:20 a.m. by Warden Sam Smith, he became aware of the stay. Out of his 36 years, Gilmore had served 18 years in jail. Outraged at the judge, he erupted, urging the civil rights appellants once again to stay out of his life. The warden of Utah State Prison entered his chamber just 4 minutes before the scheduled time at 7:49 a.m. and informed him that the death punishment had to be carried out. He was strapped onto a black upholstered oak chair. Approximately 8 yards away, he stood before a canvas cubicle with 5 tiny slots and a weapon protruding from each one, with a white target over his heart and a black hood over his head. During a press conference inside the jail, Larry Schiller, one of the 4 official witnesses to Gilmore's execution, provided a detailed account of how the warden handed coffee cups while Gilmore was being prepared in the chair. 5 men started shooting. When the hunting rifles were shot at the white target over his heart, 1 man had the standard blank in his gun. The site, which is situated on a salt flat 20 miles south of Salt Lake City and surrounded by towering snow-capped mountains, was then shown to journalists. While they examined the bloodstains, the corpse was being transported by ambulance to the hospital so that the organs of the deceased man could be removed and transplanted as per his request. Gilmore chose to be put to death by firing squad, a unique method of execution that is illegal in most places. "Let's do it," his last words to the executioners, became a well-known quote. The number of executions did not increase right away after Gilmore's death. By the end of 1982, just 5 additional prisoners had been put to death, and 3 of them, including Gilmore, had willingly given up on their appeals. After Gilmore's execution, though, things accelerated, with 1,443 convicts executed in the U.S. in the first 40 years. Dale Selby Pierre, August 28, 1987. William D. Andrews, July 30, 1992. Just before the hi-fi shop closed on April 22, 1974, Dale Selby Pierre, William Andrews, Keith Roberts, and 3 other men drove there in 2 vans. Roberts and another man stayed with the cars, but 4 of the group burst into the shop brandishing guns. Stanley Walker, a 20-year-old employee, and Michelle Ansley, an 18-year-old employee, were held captive inside the store at the time. Pierre and Andrews led the 2 down the basement of the shop and restrained them. Then the group started robbing the shop. Later, Courtney Naisbitt, 16, who had stopped by the store earlier that day to express gratitude to Walker for letting him park his car there while he conducted an errand next door, was also kidnapped and held captive in the basement with Walker and Ansley. Stanley Walker's 43-year-old father, Orrin Walker, went to the store later that evening, concerned that his son had not come home. A while later, Carol Peterson Naisbitt, Courtney's mother, also showed up at the business searching for her son, who was running late for home. Carol Naisbitt and Orrin Walker were brought down to the basement and restrained. This increased the hostage count to 5 in total. Pierre ordered Andrews to retrieve something from their van, as there were now 5 hostages in the basement. Pierre filled a cup with drain cleaner bearing the Drano logo from a bottle that Andrews brought back in a brown paper bag. When Oren refused to give it to the other captives as Pierre had commanded, he was restrained, placed face down on the basement floor, and had his mouth gagged. The captives were then forced to drink the drano, which Pierre and Andrews said to them was vodka mixed with sleeping drugs, while they were propped up in sitting positions. The victims instantly developed lip blisters, burned tongues and throats, and had the skin surrounding their mouths peeled. Oren claimed that Ansley coughed less than the other victims, despite the fact that she was still pleading for her life and had to swallow the drano. In an attempt to stop the captives' cries to absorb large amount of drain cleaner, Pierre and Andrews attempted to duct tape their mouths shut, but the glue was unable to adhere due to the leaking blisters. Oren was the last to receive the drano, but after witnessing what was happening to the other captives, he opened his lips, let it spill, and imitated his son's fits and cries. Pierre shot Carol and Courtney Naisbitt in the back of the head, killing Carol but leaving Courtney alive because he was enraged that the deaths were happening too slowly, too loudly, and too messy. Pierre then took a direct shot at Oren Walker. After killing Stanley, he shot Oren once more, just missing the back of his head. After instructing Andrews to leave for half an hour, Pierre led Ansley to the far corner of the basement, where he brutally essayed her and made her take off her clothes at gunpoint. He then let her use the restroom while he watched, dragged her back to the other captives while she was still nude, put her on her face, and shot her in the back of the head. Her final words, according to Oren's testimony, were, "I am too young to die." When Pierre saw that Oren was still alive, he mounted the man, put a wire around his throat, and attempted to choke him. Andrews witnessed everything. Pierre and Andrews stuck a ballpoint pen inside his ear. Pierre pounded on it till it snapped, pierced his eardrum, and came out of his throat. After completing the process of packing the stolen audio equipment into their van, Pierre and Andrews left. Michelle Ansley worked at the hi-fi shop for just 1 week at the time of the murders. She was just 18 years old. She had recently gotten engaged, and her wedding was scheduled on August 5, 1974. Pierre shot and killed Ansley after essaying her. Courtney Naisbitt attended Ogden High School and was 16 years old. Despite surviving his wounds, he experienced amnesia, which prevented him from testifying during the trial. More than a year after the incident, Naisbitt was allowed to return to school, and in 1976 he graduated from high school with his class. However, the neurological damage he sustained from his head wound prompted him to leave college. He was forced to apply for Social Security help since he was unable to work. Catherine Hunter and Naisbitt married on November 15, 1985. He lived the remainder of his life in constant pain and passed away on June 4, 2002, at the age of 44. Courtney Naisbitt's mother, 52-year-old Carol Naisbitt, was a victim in the attack. Pierre shot her and she passed away in the hospital. Stanley Walker's father, 43-year-old Oren Walker, was also a victim. He testified against the attackers in trial after surviving the attack. At age 69, he passed away on February 13, 2000. 20-year-old Stanley Walker worked at the hi-fi shop. Pierre shot him to death. The bodies were found nearly 3 hours later when Oren's wife and other son went to the store in search of them. As Mrs. Walker phoned the Ogden police, Oren's son heard sounds coming from the basement and busted down the rear door. Carol Naisbitt was carried by ambulance to St. Benedict's Hospital, but she was declared dead upon arrival. Stanley Walker and Ansley had already passed away. Courtney was not expected to live, but he did, despite suffering serious and permanent brain damage. He spent 266 days in the hospital before being allowed to go home. Oren Walker survived with severe burns to his mouth, chin, and damage to his ear from the pen. In Farmington, in nearby Davis County, Pierre, Andrews, and Roberts were on trial jointly for first-degree murder and robbery on October 15, 1974. On November 16 the same year, Roberts was found guilty only of robbery, but Pierre and Andrews were found guilty of all charges and received death sentences 4 days later. Roberts was paroled in 1987 after serving a 5-year-to-life sentence. Pierre was 21 years old at the time of the crime. Andrews was 19 years old at the time. Let's not forget, they were in the Air Force. Pierre, then 34 years old, was put to death by lethal injection on August 28, 1987, following his denial of mercy. Instead of having one last meal, Pierre chose to fast, pray, sing hymns, and study the Bible on his last day. His final words were, "Thank you, I'm just going to say my prayers." After spending 18 years on death row, Andrews, then 37 years old, was put to death by lethal injection on July 30th, 1992 at 1:30 in the morning. He had a banana split with his sister and niece for his final dinner. His last words were, "Thank those who tried so hard to keep me alive. I hope they continue to fight for equal justice after I'm gone. Tell my family goodbye and I love them." He was declared dead at 1:46 a.m. Roberts was 19 years old when the crime was committed. After serving nearly 13 years in prison, he was granted release on May 12, 1987. He then moved to Chandler, Oklahoma to live with his family. In 1989, it was revealed that he was employed by an electronics company in Oklahoma City. On August 8, 1992, he took his own life. It was barely a week after Andrews' execution. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.